So when you go to create your own training program, you basically have 4 different variables that you can kind of manipulate here: volume, frequency, intensity, and relative intensity. So we've got those 4 different variables. And when it comes to programming, you can kind of manipulate these variables based on your goals, based on your preferences, your access in the gym, your daily stress levels, and that sort of thing to kind of get to your goals. That's kind of what periodization is. It's the planned variation in these training variables to get towards your goals. All right, so this video, we're going to cover that. We're going to cover some training principles, and after it, you should be able to create a pretty good training program for bodybuilding purposes. All right, so let's cover volume first. So as you probably know, if you're watching this video, volume is probably the leading driver for hypertrophy, the main driver that we need to look out for. And when it comes to volume, this is how many hard sets you're doing per week. All right, how many hard sets you're doing per muscle per week. And I just like to count direct sets. I think that is easiest. So a set of barbell rows, that's just 1 set for the back, nothing for the biceps. All right, and a good rule of thumb is starting around 10 sets per muscle per week, and then seeing how you recover and that sort of thing and scaling from there. All right, and we'll touch on how to kind of manipulate these variables depending on how you're actually responding, because I think that's the most important thing here in a sec. All right, so that's volume. Frequency, how many times you train a muscle per week. It seems as though there's probably actually not a huge difference between like once and twice a week, but it does seem like twice a week is better than once. But is 3 better than 2? Is 4 better than 2? It's hard to say. I don't think that we have enough research at this point. I think that mechanistically, for more trained individuals, I can see the argument for, based on kind of muscle protein synthesis, for why you might want to train a muscle every 42 to 72 hours, so a few times a week. But also, anecdotally, in more trained athletes, they almost see their frequency go down a little bit. So I think that there's constant interplay there between how trained you are and how frequently it might be a good idea. But I think that in general, a couple times a week per muscle is a good idea. And then depending on your preferences, you can kind of distribute it whatever you want. All right, so that's frequency. Intensity. So this is going to be how much weight you're lifting compared to your 1 rep max. I think it's easier to think about this in terms of a rep range. So what rep range are you working in? And for hypertrophy purposes, I think you can be flexible with this as well. The 5 to 30 rep range is probably a pretty good call though. All right, so for hypertrophy, let's stick in that 5 to 30 rep range for the most part. And then having some variation in there from whether it's within a single session or throughout your training week, varying your rep range is probably a pretty good idea. All right, and then the 4th variable, relative intensity. So how close you're training to failure. I think for hypertrophy purposes, it's probably a good idea to train within about 4 reps from failure all the time. But I also think it's a good idea to use relative intensity to manage fatigue, which I'll get to in just a sec. So those are our 4 variables now. Now let's talk about a few principles to hypertrophy training. So the 3 biggest ones. I did not mean to do that, I swear. Specificity. So your training should be specific to the adaptations that you want to take place. All right, that's the first one. The second one, progressive overload. So training on paper has to get harder. Whether it's actually going to be relatively harder, I'm not sure. Because when I just started out training, like 1 set of squats was pretty damn hard. And now I'm going to have to do more than 1 set of squats to see adaptation. But now 3 sets of squats might feel like kind of what 1 set of squats used to feel like. So I'm not sure if it actually has to get relatively that much harder. I think that training should always be consistently hard. So I think that just saying that progressive overload is training harder over time, I actually don't think that's the case. Because I think you are limited and how hard you can train, I think that a more accurate statement would be progressive overload is increasing the absolute training stress over time. So that's progressive overload. Probably need to increase the absolute training stress to some degree over time to continue to elicit adaptation. And number 3, fatigue management. So fatigue management is managing the fatigue from training. This is through deloads, light days, off days, that sort of thing. Those are the 3 main ones, all right? There's other principles as well, but I think that if you have those 3 in place, you're doing a fantastic job. So, how do we put this all together in a training program? Well, let's look at our volume. Starting around your MEV and working up to your maximum recoverable volume is probably a pretty good idea. That way, throughout a mesocycle, you are progressively overloading via volume throughout the mesocycle. So, each and every week, you might add a little bit of volume. Now, how much do you add and where should you add your volume? It's hard to say, and it depends on your specific goals. Don't think that you just have to train up to your MRV because some guy on YouTube said it's a good idea to train between your MEV and MRV. Make sure you consider what your actual goals are. For example, I've said this before, if my legs don't grow much more over the rest of my life, I'm not going to be that hurt about it. So for me in my training, I'm not pushing leg volume to the maximum. But I do want to see more arms, more shoulders, more of that upper chest, which I think that we're getting there a little bit there. I need to rock these deeper V's a little bit more, but train up to your MRV in the muscle groups that you care about most and get clear on what is important to you, all right? Because we have a limited capacity to train in the gym. So by training from your MEV to your MRV, it's probably a good idea. So where's that MEV at? Well, a slight amount of soreness, a little bit of a pump, and subjectively feeling pretty hard for your training session. Probably around your MEV. MRV is probably when your performance starts to decrease. You start feeling more irritable. You see signs that you're not sleeping as well. You're not getting a good pump in the gym. You're not getting a good mind-muscle connection. All signs of you're around your MRV. So training between those 2 points. And what I would do is each week, I would track. This comes down to adjusting your volume based on how you're responding. So I would track your soreness, your subjective ratings of how hard a session felt, and your performance. And also how good of a pump you're getting. So each week, you might shoot for a slight amount of soreness, a pretty good pump, and progressively, the session should probably feel a little bit harder each and every week throughout your mesocycle. And if you're doing that, you're doing a good job. And you can decrease volume on muscle groups that are getting excessively sore and increase it on ones where you're not getting sore at all. All right? Make sure, though, to start out a little conservative and scale your volume along with your recovery capabilities throughout a mesocycle. I think that it is a good idea to scale your volume with your recovery capabilities as you take advantage of the repeated bout effect and that sort of thing, because it seems as though the more recoverable volume we do throughout a mesocycle, the more hypertrophy we see. All right? So that is volume throughout a mesocycle. Working from your MEV to your MRV by tracking those indicators and increasing or decreasing depending on your goals and how you're responding. All right? Now frequency. I think it doesn't matter that much. I really don't. I think that train each muscle group a couple times a week and do it based on your preferences. Don't worry about what your split is too much. Just distribute that volume. Maybe it's probably a good idea to distribute that volume a little bit evenly throughout the week. So don't just say, okay, I need to train my quads twice a week and then train them on Monday and Tuesday. Try to line it up so you distribute that volume across the week. So maybe 5 sets Monday and 5 sets on Thursday or Friday. All right? And that's about it for frequency. I really think so. Intensity, like I said, 5 to 30 rep range. For every once in a while, throw in some metabolite work, some drop sets, supersets, pump sets, stuff like that for certain muscle groups. I'd pick 2 to 3 per mesocycle and rotate that each mesocycle. That's the approach I like. And make sure to have some variation in your rep range throughout your training cycle. For relative intensity, I think it can be as easy as in your first couple of weeks of your mesocycle, keep 2 to 4 reps in the tank. In weeks 3 and 4, maybe you keep 1 to 2 reps in the tank. And then maybe in your 5th week or your 6th week, however long your accumulation is, then you see more 1 rep in reserve, 0 reps in reserve, more failure, that sort of thing. And that allows you to manage that fatigue across a mesocycle. So you're not kind of gassing yourself too early in a mesocycle and resulting in less progress. Like there was actually a pretty cool study done in bicyclists, and they gave them, I don't know if it was I don't think it was morphine. It was some painkiller. And essentially, they gave them the painkiller and told them to go balls out. And that's exactly what they did. They couldn't feel pain, but their performance wasn't any better when they didn't have that painkiller because they gassed themselves too early on in their cycling test to where they just ran out of energy and they couldn't sustain their performance. So I think that there's a nice balance there between training hard, but not so hard to where you gas yourself earlier on in a mesocycle to where you end up doing less work because of it. All right? So that's how I would approach a mesocycle. I would maybe you start around 10 sets and you scale volume depending on how you are recovering and those indicators I talked about. You train a muscle group a couple times a week. You start out with a few more reps in reserve and work closer to failure. You vary your rep range, and then I think you're doing a really good job. And how do you know if you're progressing? Well, if you're looking better at X body weight, you're probably progressing. If you're getting stronger for reps across multiple mesocycles, you're probably progressing. All right, those are the 2 biggest things I would look at is photos and your strength for reps. Now, what do you do at the end of that mesocycle? Take a deload, rinse and repeat. In my experience, someone's MEV and MRV usually doesn't change that much from meso to meso. So I actually think you can keep cycling that volume range once you get it pinned up pretty good. All right, and then for the deload, I think that it's probably easiest to just take a full week deload. I don't necessarily think you have to, but I think that it just works well with people's schedules to take a full week as a deload. I like to cut volume in half, so cut week 1 volume in half, and then I keep 3 to 4 reps in reserve in the first half of the week, and then 5+ reps in reserve in the second half. And that usually works out pretty dang well. All right? So that's how I would approach a training cycle there, and that's kind of would be my approach to programming. Now, exercise selection and that sort of thing, make sure the exercise you choose trains your target muscle group. I wouldn't worry too much about feeling the muscle on certain lifts like squats, deadlifts, even bench press. I wouldn't worry about it too much. But on those isolation lifts, I'd make sure to get a nice feel. And I would split your volume up to where 50 to 70% of your exercises, probably those basic barbell, dumbbell, basic compound lifts. But for the rest, I would fill that up with isolation lifts. I think it's a good idea. All right, and then each mesocycle, I like to swap out at least 1 exercise per muscle group. So you're getting a little bit of variation there. You're getting a little bit of different angles, that sort of thing, and it's just more enjoyable. All right? So that's how I would generally approach training. And then if you start to do multiple hypertrophy mesocycles in a row and you start your next mesocycle, you notice you're not as well recovered and you just don't feel as good starting the following mesocycle, then maybe you're getting close to kind of a primer phase and stuff like that, which I never plug stuff, but Revive Stronger has a book on primer phases that's good shit. I've read it a few times, so it's good. It will lay out exactly how to do a primer, when to do it, and stuff like that. But that's how I would approach training. Now, for nutrition, I think that it's a good idea to try to spend the majority of your time at least at maintenance, if not slightly gaining. I think that trying to gain about 1% of your body weight per month is a good idea. Trying to have 4 massing months compared to 1 cutting month is probably a good minimum there to where for every 4 months of massing, 1 month of cutting. I think that's a solid approach. And I would make sure that you're not spending too much time kind of below your settling range to where you have a lot of food focus and your training is trash and you're irritable, your sleep sucks, that sort of thing. I wouldn't mess around below that a whole bunch. Can you go below it sometimes for shows, competitions, events? Sure, absolutely. But I wouldn't try to make a bunch of progress there. And yeah, that's kind of how I structure training and that sort of thing. So hopefully this is helpful. I'm sure I left some stuff out, but I think that there's some good stuff in here. So drop any questions you have down below. I think I'm going to do a Q&A next week. And yeah, I'll see you next Sunday.